Tom and I moved to a small town, leaving behind the noise of the big city. A new life in a cozy house on quiet streets seemed like a wonderful idea. It felt like exactly what we needed. We were unpacking things, laughing about how we couldn't find the tools we needed, and dreaming about how our garden would look. Sometimes I would sit by the window and stare out at the street, trying to find something to distract me from the loneliness. But there was only silence. One day, I decided to talk to him about it. "Tom, have you noticed that we hardly talk to each other anymore?" I asked him during dinner, hoping he would at least look at me. He slowly put down his fork and looked at me, as if he was hearing my thoughts for the first time. "I'm just working a lot." His reply was quick, almost automatic. "I'm doing it for us, you understand? It's just temporary." I nodded, but something tightened inside me. There was no sincerity in his voice, only fatigue. We both knew the problem ran deeper, but neither of us wanted to admit it. Every time I was alone in the empty house, it felt like the walls were closing in on me, filling the space with silence. A few months after we moved, Tom unexpectedly told me that his father, Henry, would be coming to stay with us. I didn't see it coming. Tom hadn't discussed this with me beforehand. He just presented it as a fact. I sighed inwardly, but said aloud, "When is he coming?" "Next week," Tom answered without looking up from his laptop. Henry had always seemed like a calm person to me, maybe even a bit distant. I had only seen him a few times at family gatherings, and those meetings didn't leave any particularly personal impression. He was polite but reserved, much like Tom. When Henry finally arrived, I was surprised at how much he had changed. After his wife's death, there was something broken in him, yet at the same time, he seemed like someone who had learned to live with it. Henry was slender, with a slightly tired look in his eyes, but his gaze remained kind. He greeted me with a warm smile. "Good to see you, Henry," I said, shaking his hand. "I hope you'll like it here." "Thank you, dear." His voice was soft, almost soothing. "I'll be glad to stay with you both, and I needed a change of scenery." Tom came home late, by which time Henry and I were already sitting in the living room having tea. Tom greeted his father briefly and then went back to his office. "Is he always this busy?" Henry asked, sighing. "Yes, ever since we moved here. Work takes up almost all of his time," I replied, feeling guilty for saying it. Henry nodded but said nothing. We talked a little more about everyday things, about how he could settle into our house, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like there was someone nearby who could listen. "Don't worry, Tom will come around," he said one evening as we sat alone at the table. "You know he's a workaholic, but he does it for both of you." I nodded, but his words brought a slight warmth to my heart. Over time, I began to notice how much Tom and I were drifting apart. "When will you come home earlier?" I asked one morning over breakfast, realizing that I couldn't remember the last time we had spent time together. "Soon, I promise," he replied, barely looking at me. But that soon never came. Henry, on the other hand, had almost become a part of our everyday life. We began spending a lot of time together. In the morning, when Tom was already at work, Henry would help me around the house, and after lunch we would take walks around town or sit in the garden, discussing everything from books and movies to his memories of his wife and their life together. "Do you ever miss the city?" Henry asked me one day as we sat on the bench outside the house. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But this place was supposed to be the start of something new for us. And now I feel like I'm only losing." Henry nodded, silently stroking his beard. His eyes showed understanding, but he didn't rush to offer advice or make assumptions. His calm, unobtrusive support was something new to me. Tom was always rational. He looked for solutions to problems, but never delved into my feelings. It was different with Henry. "When I lost my wife," he began after a while. "For a long time, I didn't know how to go on. But time, it helps. And so does talking. I'm glad I can talk to you." I felt that his words weren't just out of politeness, that there was more to them than just a desire to keep the conversation going. His sensitivity and ability to listen were becoming something more than just a habit. He was someone who understood me more deeply than anyone had in a long time. One evening, when Tom was working late again, I asked Henry, "Do you think this will ever change?" He sighed, his gaze soft and attentive. "I don't know. But to be honest, you can't always wait for others to change. Sometimes you need to change something within yourself." Those words made me think. With each passing day, I found myself seeking more support from Henry, even if it was just in those brief conversations that distracted me from the growing emptiness. Tom had practically disappeared from my life, and with him, all of our connection. Henry, on the other hand, was there, quietly and unobtrusively. Sometimes it seemed like he was the only one who really noticed how I was feeling. One afternoon, when Tom was once again lost in his work, Henry suggested we go for a walk. We went to the park, where the trees were turning yellow and dropping leaves beneath our feet at this time of year. The air was cool but not cold, perfect for the long walks I had started to enjoy. "I'm glad you agreed to this walk," Henry said as we stopped by a small lake. "Sometimes all you need is some fresh air to clear your mind." "Yes, fresh air helps," I replied with a smile, "but I still can't seem to clear my mind." Henry looked at the water for a long time, as if contemplating what to say next. "I went through this too, you know?" he finally said softly, almost in a whisper. "When my wife passed, it felt like the world just stopped. I was lost. But I found comfort in simple things, and in people. Sometimes we just need someone to be there." I turned my head toward him. His gaze was warm, almost fatherly, but beneath it there was another depth that I had started to notice. Henry was no longer just an elderly man who had survived loss. He was becoming something more in my life. I realized that our conversations had moved beyond the usual exchange of words. There was an underlying meaning, an unspoken tension that made me feel both anxious and warm at the same time. That evening, as we sat in the kitchen having tea, Tom was once again absent, and Henry and I talked about everything. Life, loss, the importance of not losing oneself. "You're an amazing woman," he suddenly said, breaking one of the pauses in our conversation. "Strong, smart. Tom is a lucky man, though he may not see it right now." Those words hit me harder than I could have expected. They were spoken calmly, almost casually, but I felt something shift inside me. His compliment wasn't just pleasant, it stirred feelings in me that I had been hiding for a long time. I looked away, trying to hide my embarrassment, but I couldn't help but respond. "You're too kind to me, Henry." "No, it's the truth." He smiled, taking another sip of tea. "Sometimes people need to be reminded that they deserve more than they're getting." It was Henry who suggested going to our neighbor's party when Tom once again immersed himself in work. I didn't enjoy such events, especially without Tom, but Henry insisted. "It will do you good," he assured me as we sat in silence in the kitchen. "We've been cooped up at home for days, and this is a chance to unwind a bit. Don't worry, I'll be with you." "Tom doesn't like these kinds of events," I objected. "He always said they were a waste of time." Henry smirked, shaking his head. "Yes, Tom isn't the most social person, but you don't have to share his views, do you?" Those words made me think. I had spent so long in the shadow of Tom's preferences, trying to adjust to his rhythm. But maybe Henry was right. I needed something of my own. I agreed to go, and we headed to the neighbors that evening. When we entered the house, we were greeted by a warm, almost homely atmosphere. Soft lamplight, quiet music, the laughter of guests. I felt a bit awkward, but Henry's presence was comforting. We mingled with different groups of people, chatted with various neighbors, but somehow we always found each other's gaze through the crowd. At one point, I caught his eyes from across the room, and that brief moment felt like a spark. Something inside me flared up, though I tried to suppress the feeling. The evening was filled with conversations and laughter, but I felt a growing tension between us. At one point, we ended up alone on the terrace. The evening was cool. A light breeze brushed against my skin, and the silence outside the house seemed loud compared to the noise of the party. Henry moved closer, and I felt the warmth of his presence beside me. "You seem like something is bothering you," he remarked. This is all unfamiliar," I replied, lowering my eyes. "I haven't been to places like this without Tom in a long time." Henry looked at me intently, and there was more than just sympathy in his gaze. "You deserve to be happy," he said softly. "Don't forget that." In that moment, I realized that something was happening between us, something I was afraid to admit. It seemed like every word he spoke, every glance he gave, held something more. After the party, we walked home through quiet, empty streets. The streetlights barely illuminated our steps, and the air felt strangely still. I remained silent, trying to gather my thoughts. What was happening between Henry and me was too unexpected. When we reached the house, I took off my coat and headed toward the kitchen, but Henry suddenly stopped me. "You seem troubled," he said softly, almost in a whisper. "Is it because of the party? Or something else?" I felt the tension building. His voice was so gentle, so attentive. He stood close, too close. "I'm just tired," I replied, trying to hide my true feelings. But my words sounded unconvincing, even to myself. Henry looked at me carefully, and in his eyes I saw something new, something that awakened a long-forgotten emotion within me, a desire to be understood, the feeling that someone truly sees you. "You know you can talk to me about anything." His voice was barely audible, and I felt my heart start to race. For a moment, everything stood still. I stood in front of him, and something inside me pushed me toward him. In the dim light of the kitchen, in the deep silence of the house, only a thin line remained between us. And then he took a step forward. "Henry," I whispered, trying to stop what was about to happen, but the words stuck in my throat. He leaned closer, and before I could fully comprehend what was happening, his lips touched mine. It was unexpected, yet at the same time, so natural. Everything I had been hiding and suppressing ignited in that one moment. I couldn't resist. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When we pulled away, a wave of guilt washed over me. I couldn't look him in the eyes. I couldn't process what had just happened. "I need to," I whispered, and without finishing my sentence, quickly headed toward the stairs, leaving him standing in the dark kitchen. In my room, I stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden, trying to calm my breathing. What had I done? Inside, a battle raged. One part of me screamed about guilt, about betraying Tom, while the other, about how that kiss was what I had been searching for, what I had been missing for so long. The night was sleepless. After that night, I tried to avoid Henry, though it was nearly impossible. He lived under the same roof, and we saw each other every day, and every time he was around, it reminded me of what I had done. The guilt grew with every moment spent in his presence. But despite my efforts to keep my distance, the tension between us lingered. Whenever we accidentally crossed paths in the hallway or kitchen, I tried to look away, and he seemed to feel the same awkwardness. Henry didn't attempt to bring up what had happened, but his silence only intensified my inner turmoil. One morning, after Tom had left for work and Henry was sitting in the living room with his newspaper as usual, I decided that I needed to put an end to this uncertainty. I gathered my courage and walked into the room. "We need to talk," I said, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Henry put down the newspaper and slowly looked up at me. He nodded, as if he already knew what this was about. "I know," he replied quietly. "It shouldn't have happened. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go that far. It was a mistake." His words should have brought me relief, but instead I felt bitter disappointment. For some reason, I had expected something different. Maybe for him to acknowledge his feelings or at least say something that would explain this strange attraction that had grown between us. But he simply apologized. And that was it. "Yes," I said, lowering my head. "It was a mistake. and I don't know how to live with it now." Henry stood up from his chair and stepped closer. He didn't try to touch me, but his presence still felt too near. "What happened shouldn't happen again," he said firmly, his voice filled with regret. "We both know that. Tom, he deserves better, and you deserve to be happy with him. I'll try to keep my distance," Henry added, his voice softening. "But if you ever need to talk, I'm always here." Those words shook my resolve once again. He was right. As much as I wanted to run from the situation, his support had become important to me. At that moment, I didn't know what to do next. Each day had become a challenge. I kept trying to convince myself that it would pass, that I could forget. But the tension between us only grew with each passing day, as if nothing could erase what had already happened. One evening, Tom came home earlier than usual. It was unexpected, and I flinched when I heard the key turn in the lock. He entered the house and, seeing me in the kitchen, hesitated, as if evaluating the situation. "Hey," he said, dropping his briefcase on the floor. "I decided to come home early, take a bit of a break." "Oh, that's great." I tried to sound calm, but I felt something tighten inside. Tom sat at the table, looking at me with a calmness that used to seem normal. But now there was something more in his gaze. Suspicion? I wasn't sure. All evening, he watched me in a way that felt different, asking questions he usually didn't ask. His attention, something I had grown so unaccustomed to, suddenly became too intense. "You've been acting strange lately," he said suddenly without taking his eyes off me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying not to give myself away. "I don't know." Tom continued to observe me. "It seems like you've become more withdrawn. Or is it just me?" My heart started beating faster. I felt cold sweat forming on my palms. Tom had never noticed things like this before. Maybe he was noticing now because of his fatigue, or maybe his intuition was finally telling him that something was wrong. "I've just been thinking a lot lately," I replied, not daring to meet his gaze. "New town, new life. You know how it is." Tom frowned as if pondering my answer, but didn't press further. We continued dinner in silence, but I could tell he wasn't settled. There was something in his gaze that made me nervous. The tension reached its peak when Henry walked into the kitchen. "Oh, Tom, you're home." Henry said it in a tone that was too neutral, and I noticed how quickly he avoided eye contact with me. Tom looked at his father carefully. He didn't say a word, but something in his gaze made me feel like he was starting to figure things out. Maybe he didn't know exactly what had happened between us, but something had shifted in the way he perceived both of us. "How was your day?" Tom asked, looking at Henry, his tone dry and distant. "Just a regular day. Nothing special," Henry replied, trying to appear calm. Tom continued to silently observe the two of us, and the air hung thick with tension. I felt that sooner or later everything would come out. It was as if there was no more room for secrets, and everything that had happened between Henry and me was on the verge of being exposed. That night I barely slept. Tom lay beside me, but I felt that he was already distant, as if he were trying to figure out what had changed in our relationship. In the darkness, I sensed his unease and knew that soon, everything would come to the surface. A few days later, everything collapsed in an instant. Tom seemed unable to let go of his suspicions, and the tension in the house became unbearable. I could feel his suspicions growing into certainty with each passing day. He watched my every move, and the pressure on me grew stronger. One day, I decided to meet with Henry at a cafe to discuss the situation. We both knew this couldn't go on. Henry tried to remain calm, but I could see that he too felt the weight of guilt. We sat at a small table by the window when I spoke. "I can't live like this anymore," I said, clasping my hands tightly. "Tom suspects something. He looks at me like he knows. I'm scared it's only a matter of time." Henry nodded, his face showing deep regret. "I feel it too," he said quietly. "It was a mistake. We should have stopped earlier." Our conversation was punctuated by brief glances we exchanged, both of us knowing that the end was inevitable. We had gone too far, and no words could undo what had already happened. At that moment, the cafe door opened and Tom walked in, shattering the silence. He looked around and froze when he saw us. His eyes met mine, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Henry turned pale instantly, his hands tensing on the table. Tom slowly walked over to our table, his face filled with silent, suppressed disappointment. He already knew. Everything we had been hiding was obvious in just one glance. "How long has this been going on?" His voice was cold, filled with pain. He didn't yell, didn't make a scene, but his words hit me like a blow. I couldn't answer. My head was full of thoughts, but no words could express the guilt and shame I felt. I knew that no matter what I said, it wouldn't save our family, or myself. "Tom, it's not what you think." Henry tried to intervene, his voice soft, but it only made Tom give a bitter smirk. "Really?" Tom turned to his father, and his eyes flared with anger. "I think it's exactly how it looks." I sat there, paralyzed, watching as everything fell apart around me. Henry tried to say something, but Tom was no longer listening. The pain in his eyes scared me. I knew I was destroying everything we had, and at that moment, I realized our marriage was beyond saving. "I'll pack my things and leave," Tom said, unexpectedly calm, as if he had made up his mind before even walking into the cafe. "It's over between us." He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me and Henry sitting in complete silence. Neither of us said a word. Henry stared down at the table, his face gray with guilt, and I felt the world around me crumble into pieces. Tom disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived. The house that once seemed like a fresh start now felt empty, filled with a heavy silence. Tom took his belongings the next day without saying a word. I stood by the window, watching as he loaded his bags into the car. His face was indifferent, as if he no longer wanted to feel anything toward me. When he drove away, I felt everything inside me collapse completely. I had lost not only my husband, but also the life we had built together. Even if it wasn't perfect, it was our life, and I had destroyed it with my own hands. From the moment the car door closed, it became clear to me. I was alone. Henry also disappeared from my life. He tried a few times to talk to me, but each conversation led nowhere. I felt that all that was left between us was guilt and emptiness. No matter how hard he tried, something had changed forever. "I think it's time for me to leave," he said one morning as we sat in the living room, lost in our own thoughts. "Tom will never forgive me, and I can't stay here. It's not right." I couldn't respond. I knew he was right. His presence in the house had become a reminder of what had happened, and I could no longer bear it. A few days later, Henry left, leaving me a short note of apology and farewell. He acknowledged his guilt, but there was something final in his words, as if he understood that no apology could change what had occurred. I was left alone in an empty house with memories that only deepened my sense of being lost. Weeks passed, but each day in that house felt like a repetition of the same thing: loneliness, guilt, silence. I tried to fill the time with something: housework, walks, even reading. But nothing could drown out the feeling that I had destroyed everything that mattered to me. I thought about Tom, imagining how he was living now. Perhaps he had already found a new life. Maybe he was trying to forget me. I knew he would never forgive me for what had happened with his father. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. Several months had passed since Tom and Henry left my life, but the feeling of emptiness didn't go away. I tried to build a new reality, to fill this house with something meaningful, but every corner reminded me of what I had lost. Silence became my constant companion, and strangely enough, over time, I began to grow accustomed to it. Each day, I would get up, make myself breakfast, go out into the garden, and sit there, watching time slowly pass. People in town continued living their lives, but I felt as though I was outside of their world. My small town, which once seemed like a peaceful refuge, had now become a place of exile for me. One day, During one of my usual walks around the neighborhood, I ran into Martha, a neighbor I rarely spoke with. She stopped, smiled, and started a conversation. "You haven't been around much lately. How are you?" Her tone was friendly, but there was curiosity in her eyes. I, I'm managing," I replied, trying not to show my pain. She nodded as if she understood more than she was willing to say aloud. I knew that rumors had spread around town. People, as they often do, love to talk about other people's lives. And most likely, everyone already knew about my breakup with Tom. I wasn't ready for anyone to intrude on my emotions. After that encounter, I became increasingly aware that the town was no longer the place where I could start over. Everything here reminded me of the past. The empty house, the evening streets, the cafe where everything was revealed. Every detail, every word spoken in the past now lived in my memory, like painful stings. Soon I realized that I needed not just to move on, but to make a decisive change. This house was no longer a place where I could find peace. It had become a symbol of my mistakes and losses. I began to think about leaving this town. The process of selling the house was difficult. Every step, from packing things to preparing documents, reminded me that I was not only leaving this place, but also a part of my life. The hardest part was sorting through old photos and items connected to Tom. They seemed to come alive in my hands, pulling me back to moments when everything still seemed possible. When I closed the door of the house for the last time, there was a strange feeling inside, a mix of relief and sadness. I was leaving behind not just the house, but the life that Tom and I had once planned. I knew it was the only way to start anew, even without a clear plan for the future. Now, I'm driving down a road into the unknown, not knowing where it will lead. Maybe in a new place, I'll find the answers I've been searching for. Or perhaps, I'll just find a way to come to terms with the past and start building a new life. But one thing I knew for sure: I had to leave behind not just the house, but the woman I had been in this town. I chose a new place, a small village by the sea, a place where no one knew me, where I could dissolve into the sound of the waves and the cold winds. It was risky. I didn't know anyone. I had no job and no clear plan, but for the first time in a long while, that didn't scare me. Perhaps this was exactly what I was looking for: a complete reset, where everything had to be rebuilt from scratch. When I first saw the ocean, standing on a cliff, something inside me shifted. The vastness of the water, its endless power, reminded me of how small and insignificant my pain was compared to the world around me. I felt a sense of freedom, the kind I had long been searching for but could never find within the walls of my old home. I rented a small cottage not far from the shore. It was modest, almost empty, but there was something cleansing about it. No photographs, no memories, no past. Just me, white walls, and the sound of the sea outside the window. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. Every morning started the same way. I would go down to the shore, feel the salty wind on my face, and stare out into the distance, imagining that each new day was bringing me something important. Sometimes I just sat on the sand and listened to the waves. Other days, I wandered the quiet streets of the new town, trying to get used to its rhythm. Time flowed differently here. I no longer needed to run, hide, or pretend. No one asked questions about my past. No one looked at me with judgment. I was living, simply living. And that was the most important thing. Over time, I found work at the local library. It was a quiet place with no rush, but there were people with whom I could exchange a few words or discuss an interesting book. This place became my little island of stability, and I started to savor every moment. One day, an elderly woman approached me, holding a book in her hands, and said, "You know, life always gives us a second chance. You just have to be brave enough to take it." Her words sank deeper than I could have expected. I smiled in return and suddenly realized that perhaps I was living that second chance right now. It wasn't loud or sudden, not accompanied by dramatic events. It was quiet, calm, and exactly what I needed. The past no longer held me back. It had become a part of who I was, but it didn't define who I had become. I began to build a new life, not by looking back at what I had lost, but with faith in what I could still find. And now, when I look at the ocean each day, I understand that there are still many roads ahead of me, and every one of them is open to me. One day, during my usual walk along the shore, I noticed a small cafe. It stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, and its windows reflected the rays of the setting sun. The place always seemed secluded to me, as if it belonged to another world. And today, I decided to step inside. The cafe was nearly empty, except for one man sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and a book. I chose a table in the corner and ordered tea. The place was cozy, with wooden chairs, vintage lamps, and soft music playing in the background. The atmosphere was almost homely, and I suddenly felt a bit lighter, as if this place had accepted me as I was. "Is this your first time here?" a voice asked. It was the man by the window. I was a bit caught off guard, not expecting a conversation, but his tone was friendly. "Yes," I replied briefly, trying to hide my uncertainty. He put his book down and smiled. "This place has a strange way of attracting people who are searching for peace. I came here for the same reason once," he said, glancing out at the sea through the window. "And did you find it?" I asked, feeling the conversation deepening for no apparent reason. "I found something else," he answered thoughtfully. "Sometimes peace doesn't come right away, but that doesn't mean it can't be reached." We continued talking, and I learned that his name was Alex. He was an artist who had moved here a few years ago, also hoping to find a new life after a personal tragedy. His story felt surprisingly close to mine. Loss, disappointment, an attempt to start over. But instead of running away from his pain, he found a way to express it through art.